And that brings me to our keynote speaker. If Penny helped us understand the national landscape and Adam helped us to understand Oregon's current reality, Charlie Brown will challenge us to think about what comes next. As Executive Director of the Trust for Civic Life, Charlie works at the intersection of community leadership, civic participation, and place-based philanthropy. The Trust invests in people, relationships, and organizations that help communities become stronger, more connected, and more resilient. That perspective makes Charlie an ideal person to open our conference. As we think about the future of independent local journalism, it's important to remember that sustaining local news isn't just about strengthening news organizations, it's also about strengthening the communities they serve. Our conference theme this year is From Survival to Sustainability, the Oregon Opportunity. Charlie's work reminds us that sustainability isn't built by any one organization acting alone. It grows from strong communities, trusted relationships, and people willing to work together towards a common purpose. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Brown.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for having me here, and thanks for coming today. Thanks to Heidi for having me. I'm going to maybe lift this up just a little bit so you all can hear me a little bit better. It sounds better. So, like Heidi said, my name is Charlie Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Trust for Civic Life, and we're a funder collaborative. So some of you may be familiar with that term, others may not. In this case, we're over 20 national funders who have pooled dollars with one common mission. How do we invest in local communities so that they can come together, often across differences, to make it a better place to live, but almost as, or even more importantly, showcase for the rest of the country what it looks like to actually build communities that are thriving and have high levels of civic engagement. Through that process, I've been able to visit communities, specifically rural communities all across the country, including right here in the Pacific Northwest and Oregon. And through that process, we've learned an incredible amount in just the 2.5 years that we've been in operations. And as we go to communities, we're always in listening mode, probably like a lot of you. We're trying to understand what's actually happening, what's on their minds, what are the priorities. And inherently what we hear is the questions that they ask. And one of the questions that, no matter where we go, consistently comes up, sometimes in settings like this, sometimes when you're in just a one-on-one meeting, maybe at a coffee shop, is how do we get people to see our community for who we truly are? And it's such a simple question, but it's often delivered with a deep level of passion and a deep level of frustration. And it's a question that I can relate to. So as a little bit of background on myself, I grew up in Fairmont, West Virginia. It's a town of 18,000. When I was a kid in high school, it was more like 21,000. It's a town that has deep Appalachian roots, specifically in coal mining. And like a lot of towns in rural areas, your identity is very much place-based. And it's based on these local points of pride that you've experienced and kind of shape who you are. They shape, in many ways, your daily life. Living in Fairmont, West Virginia, it was the three rivers that came together, met in town, and ultimately flowed into the Ohio and the Mississippi. It was a culture that was this incredible blend of Italian and Polish immigrants who came to work in the mines, and ultimately shaped all of our civic organizations, and a pretty good, although sometimes a little odd, local food scene. Which I still love to go back to, and my kids find interest. They're like, why are we eating this food? But it's still good. And I think more importantly, we have a state motto in West Virginia, and still do, that we take with a lot of personal pride. Mountaineers are always free. Yet, when I would travel to other places and have the opportunity, whether that was through school or with my parents' work, I was exposed to a very different reality and set of perspectives about what it meant to be from West Virginia. And they often started with what I think the other person may have thought was a funny joke to break the ice or maybe enter in, but they always sat around a set of common themes. That if you're from West Virginia, you're uneducated, you're poor, you can't solve your own problems, you can't be trusted to make your community a better place, and worst of all was you're a dependent on the rest of the country. It was uncanny that I would go places and realize this is the first thing that people are going to say. The second thing they would say was a joke about Charlie Brown. So I had this like whole lineup where I'm like, I know what's coming. But it led to this sensibility that even as a kid, it was like, wow, this sensibility of your identity of being from a rural place can actually be a barrier to your aspirations and dreams. So much so that in the 6th grade, I worked incredibly hard to get rid of what was a very thick West Virginia accent that is well documented on some home videos that my kids love to pull out. But I think that's the same thing that happens to rural communities all the time. When we aren't seen and respected for who we are, we make sacrifices to succeed. And I think this is the rub. Through the Trust work, we know that rural communities are leaders in civic engagement and civic renewal, oftentimes in remarkable ways. Yet we also see, day in, day out, that these same rural communities are contorting themselves to be seen by others from the outside so they can get the resources needed to fulfill their potential. That is not a sustainable process, and it's not a process that recognizes, reflects, and rewards the efforts of local communities. And so if we took a step back to say, well, let's think about, well, what are rural communities? Because like with any place or any situation, there are ups and downs. There are positives and negatives, and there are successes and challenges. When we think about the realities of rural communities, which are core to our investment, there's a few factors that you just have to recognize. Inside rural communities, they represent roughly 80% of persistent poverty counties in this country. 80%. It's a pretty high number. They tend to have some of the highest levels of racial disparities in the country. They have some of the lowest levels of institutional trust. And I think maybe most interesting out of all of this, rural population across this country represents about 21% of the population. They get 3% of philanthropy. So we're saying 21% of the population gets 3% of philanthropy. Just to make that even more stark, if we're in San Francisco and we thought about per capita dollars that are actually reaching that city, so for every resident across the year, about $1,400 of philanthropic dollars go into that person or per capita. If we just went down to the Central Valley, not very far away, about an hour, hour and a half, it's $70. When we think about our work at the Trust for Civic Life, this sits core to our purpose. How do we change the number, the value, the type of resources that are actually flowing into rural communities? And I think it's important to do that not just because of some of the challenges that I highlighted, but actually because of all of the assets that rural communities represent. I said they have really low levels of institutional trust, often some of the lowest in the country. Yet they have some of the highest levels of social trust. Why? Because for those of you who live in rural communities or have spent time in them, you know that when power goes out at your house and your neighbor has a generator and you need to do something with electricity, you don't really care who they voted for, what their background was, or how much money they have. You're going to go and ask for help, and they're going to give it because they would do the exact same thing back. Rates of community engagement and volunteering higher in rural communities consistently than their urban counterparts. Why? Because you know that when you want to see a community succeed, there's no one else to look to. You're the one that's going to come and do it, and it's that same neighbor that you would go to and help to actually deliver on that promise of making the place better. And while, yes, rural communities only get 3% of total philanthropy, they also know how to do a lot more with a lot less, because you have to. You haven't been given much of an option otherwise. And this creates a very interesting opportunity when we think about how do we renew civic engagement, but also how do we renew journalism in this country. Rural communities offer this opportunity, and in many regards, laboratory to show the rest of the country, this is how it can be done, and this is what is possible. And while I think there's many generalizations about rural communities, whether you're from West Virginia, whether you're from Oregon, whether you're from anywhere else in this country, I also consistently hear as we travel across the country, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. No two are the same. Some are growing rapidly while others are losing population. Policy and political landscapes change, even sometimes just across the county line. And while the stats may be similar, it's each individual place that creates this unique identity that makes us long for the place where we're from and the place where we live and wanting to see it be even better than we found it. So I think just as rural communities consistently ask, how do we get people to see our community? There also is this other shared mantra we hear no matter where we're traveling. I hear it here in Oregon. I was just in the Adirondacks visiting grantees. I heard it there. And sometimes I feel like there must be some subreddit for civic leaders in rural communities. And it's an alignment of messaging that they're going through. Because the statement is, no one is coming to save us, so it's time to save ourselves. Literally those words, almost exact, no matter where I am in the country. And so at the Trust for Civic Life, we believe these factors make rural America the leaders in showing the country what it takes to rebuild trust, agency, and most importantly, that all that adds up to an improved quality of life. So the Trust for Civic Life, what do we do about that? So let me tell you a little bit about our journey towards here. So it actually starts in 2020. In 2020, the Academy of Arts and Sciences did 50 listening sessions across the country asking, I think what they thought was a relatively straightforward question. What's it look like to reimagine Americans' democracy? What they found pretty quickly is people are not sitting around the dinner table or the water cooler at work or maybe the Slack channel online talking about democracy. Instead, what they're talking about is what's going on in the place where they live. They want to talk about whether or not the park's going to get cleaned up. Are the schools good? Are they going to get the type of health care they desire? I remember right at this time we were having conversations in Eastern Oregon. It was, are the maternity wards going to close? And as we talked to people in Eastern Oregon about, well, tell me what that means, they gave us incredibly sophisticated answers that I think once again showed just how right rural communities are in understanding systems and how things connect together. They would say, if the maternity ward closes, it means my grandchildren may not be born here. And if my grandchildren aren't born here, it means we won't have young families to fill jobs. And if we don't have young families to fill jobs, we won't have the people who will buy my business when I'm ready to retire. And if there's no one here to buy my business when I'm ready to retire, it means we're going to have a shrinking tax base. And that shrinking tax base means we're going to get less critical services, and it's going to be harder to have a community that succeeds. For any person that ever doubted the intelligence, skill, or insight of a rural community, that right there is to me an incredibly sophisticated understanding of how systems work and what happens when a community is invested in and what happens when de-investment actually happens. And so we heard those conversations consistently, and what we also heard is people want to invest in their community. They care about it, they love it. And one of the recommendations that came out of that report was a goal to dramatically increase our civic capacity through high-risk investment by philanthropy. And over the next 3 years, since 2020, Stephen Heinz, who was the co-chair of that Our Common Purpose report by the Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the president of Rockefeller Brothers Fund in New York, kept coming back to this recommendation and kept thinking, like, what does it mean for us to actually do that? And he wasn't alone. The philanthropies of Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, as well as Charles Koch, were also asking the same question. And those three came together, which if you know anything about those three or their backgrounds, it is very unlikely partners to come together and work on something around our country's future of democracy or civics, but they did it because they saw the opportunity that was possible by investing in local communities. So in 2023, we took that same exploration they did and we went to 60 rural communities this time. And we asked two questions. What's it look like when your community has a high level of local engagement? And what is the role of philanthropy in supporting that? And once again, we hear a consistent set of responses come back to us no matter which one of those 60 communities that we're in. And most commonly what we heard is, I love the place I live, I want to be more involved in making it better, but the opportunities to do so are outdated, run by people who don't represent my community, often outsiders, aren't fun, take too long, aren't solving problems, I can't do them in between the two jobs I have, they're at odd times. You want me to go to a meeting for 4 hours that doesn't end in a solution? Not going to do it. And what we saw inside of that, if we thought about it like a customer, we have a customer who's saying, I want to be more involved in my community because I love it so much and I would spend my time for free to make it a better place. But the chances you're giving me, I'm not interested. I heard that going right back to the comment and the quote that we hear consistently is, how do I be seen by others for who our community is and what we want? People don't feel seen. The opportunities they're being given are not the ones that they want. At the same time, when we talk to communities where that community engagement was high, that civic pride and spirit was really just flourishing across the community, they almost always identified an organization that had three things in common. One is they were bringing the community together around a shared vision. And sometimes that shared vision was big. In Morganton, North Carolina, where one of our grantees is, the goal was to revitalize the textile industry that left in the 1990s. And they have successfully done that in remarkable ways through employee-owned businesses. But if you went 5 hours north of Morganton, North Carolina, closer to where I grew up in Buchanan, West Virginia, the goal was to build a boat dock in the local park because local government wasn't getting it done. And so they built that boat dock in the local park. So they bring the community together to say, what's the thing we want to do? What's our priority? The second thing they do is they coordinate lots of efforts to bring that to reality. That doesn't mean they have to run the programs. It means they're building the conditions and cultures. They're kind of building that marketplace so that people can say, oh, I'd like to go to that event, or I'd like to be part of this organization. And they're creating an entrepreneurial spirit. And then the third thing is they cultivate the human and financial resources to make sure all those efforts and activities actually work to deliver on that promise. And when we have that cycle going, what we saw is sometimes those small wins at that boat dock turn into dramatic outcomes. So an example of Buchanan, West Virginia, they started with that boat dock. And then they turned around and said, you know, this park that we're in could use some cleaning up. So they had the boat dock, then they cleaned up the park. And then they had more people come together and they said, you know what we should do? We should build a grandstand in the park. So they built a stage and a grandstand. Then they started holding summer Friday night concert series. Then they realized that the biggest threat to the park, the dock, and the concert series was an outdated sewage system. And then they lobbied the local government and state government to get funds to replace that sewage system. Then they decided they should be solving all sorts of problems, and they hold a monthly lunch that is unfacilitated, which I think is insane, but they do it. It's a monthly unfacilitated lunch. Anybody can come. You put an issue on the table. If you've got a solution and you're going to work with other community members to solve it, a local philanthropist will give you $500 to $1,000 on the spot to go do it. They stacked all these small wins, and now they've built this culture that the communities around them say, wait a second, why aren't we doing that? Let's go do that too. The reality is civic pride and civic engagement is infectious when you go and see it. So these organizations, which ultimately we have come to call civic hubs, have become the core of our grant making. They're pre-political. What they've come and told us, and when we were designing our grant making strategy, was do not come in here with your hot button top-down issue. You got to let us decide what's important. Because too many philanthropists are coming in and saying, you know what you need to focus on, and it's often a big national political issue. And what happens, which you all probably know more than I do in your local communities, is the loudest voice on the right and the left stand up and everyone else sits down. And we want the opposite to happen. And so $10 million a year is what we invest. Over the past 2.5 years, we've invested in 66 civic hubs across the country. 2 of them are right here in Oregon, High Desert Partnership down in Hardy County, Thrive Umpqua over on the other side of the state. Through those groups, we've also started investing in local organizations and efforts in their communities. Sometimes those are public libraries, sometimes those are business clubs, sometimes they're community gardens. We're not here to say what it should be. We're here to give the communities the opportunity to say, this is what we want, and let us show you how we can deliver on that. Just to give a couple examples of how these civic hubs play out and what they might look like, if we went all the way west, furthest west we can go in this country, to Hawaii and the Big Island, Janice Ikeda started an organization called Vibrant Hawaii. The spark was, as part of indigenous communities living there, they felt like they had become characters in people's bucket list vacations. And the response to that was very clear in the sense that when there was a natural disaster, who were the last people to get funding or support from the state or the federal government? It was the local communities, because they went to support the tourism industry first. And so they said, once again, no one's coming to save us, time to save ourselves. And they started resilience hubs all across the island, building the ability to actually respond and maintain their own needs around local community management. They then said, what we're seeing here is we're moving this idea that we are no longer clients of services coming to us, but we are contributors to our own community success. They started addressing food insecurity, and the people who were the most active, best volunteers were the people who were food insecure. They started running cultural programs. They started seeing other islands say, we would like this too, and now they're actually spreading their models all the way out in California and even into the Midwest. If we went back to my home state of West Virginia, there's a group, Coalfield Development. Coalfield Development is a workforce development program for all ostensible purposes. You would look at it and say, its goal is to get people in good paying jobs, particularly those who have been left behind when the coal industry has left. What they've seen, though, is you don't stop with a job. You stop with this idea of citizenship, which is building the civic skills for you to be able to make a great place to live. Because you can have a good paying job, but if you live in a place that's not very great, what's it really matter? And the reality is, if the place isn't great, the job's always a risk. Always a risk. And so that last step of that workforce development program is actually civic engagement. You have to go and bring your community members together to do a project, which is often downtown revitalization or supporting small businesses, or sometimes taking a neglected cornerstone building and turning it into a community center. And what they see are communities flourishing through this one small step of not just thinking about the job, but thinking about what we want to do to rebuild our community. And while we also fund community foundations, CDFIs, all sorts of groups, the commonality is, once again, they're bringing communities back together to say, what do we want to do? How do we create lots of ways for people to engage? And how do we make sure that we have the resources for them to be successful? And in partnership with these civic hubs, as well as Johns Hopkins University, specifically the Agora Institute there, we've gone and done research to understand, well, what is really happening when we think about civic engagement and civic spirit? And there's 4 things that we have found that I think are incredibly relevant for today's conversation and the work that all of you do. 1, it's not surprising. Trust at the national level is collapsing at really high rates. But trust at local levels is remaining really strong. So in local surveys that we do, just over the past 2 years, trust in the presidency and Congress by rural communities has dropped 46%, while trust in local institutions has stayed steady at really robust levels. Second, agency and belonging thrive in local communities. So even as Americans feel pretty powerless when we talk about national affairs or existential threats to our world, whether that's AI, whether it's global wars, changing economy, climate change, the reality is you can do a lot in your local community and you can see that change happen. And so almost 3/4 of survey respondents said their community comes together to solve problems effectively. When you look at that against a national level of whether we believe we can come together across differences to solve problems, it is stark to see the difference there. Rural Americans are crossing divides every day in their daily life. So we found that large numbers of rural Americans are working together outside of formal civic engagement to build common ground with people of political difference or different backgrounds. And these efforts are often as simple as inviting someone into their home, helping a neighbor who needs a little bit of help, or just getting involved in doing the right thing when they see it happening in their community. We invest a lot of money philanthropically and across this country in highly organized, very structured activities to sometimes find it's as simple as just doing that act of kindness with your neighbor. And lastly, certain local institutions are trusted literally everywhere. No matter where you go, there are 3 institutions that they are always the stalwarts of trust in their community: libraries, nonprofits, and community foundations. They have an average of over 80% of respondents saying they trust them at extremely high levels. And this is despite a portrayal at national levels that they are often political operatives and often pushing political agendas. So in each community, civic hubs are at the core of these trends. Because we found that when a community does not have a civic hub, a lot of times these efforts, these individual important aspects of a community's engagement can feel like pushing a rock up a hill. And in the first year, we made a set of small grants outside of civic hubs to see whether we could go fund those community gardens, those business associations, those block parties effectively ourselves. And when we went back a year later, we heard once again the same thing from so many communities. I'm so inspired and we are so happy with Betsy's work. We could interchange that with John or Jim or anybody else. But we love what Betsy's doing. It's so inspiring. She is our hero. I could never do what Betsy does. When we went to communities where civic hubs were there, we found a different response, which was, we're so glad that Betsy does this work. Thank God she's doing it. She's our hero. She inspired me to get involved too. That's the outcome we want. We want people to say, I can do that too. I can go and get involved. And if we don't have a civic hub, it's harder to do that. And so coming back to why we're here today, journalism, I mentioned that we have these top 3 institutions that have really high levels of trust: libraries, nonprofits, community foundations. Well, we also have some organizations that have lower levels of trust in these surveys, and unfortunately, local news is consistently at the bottom of that list. So if we're over 80% of trust when we look at libraries, community foundations, and nonprofits, local journalism is at the bottom, tied with local government at 47%. What I believe this reflects is not that there is a consistent lack of trust in local journalism. I think it reflects wildly and radically differing conditions across rural communities in this country. I also think it reflects a sense that the field in which I spend the overwhelming majority of my time, civic engagement, and you could even extend that into kind of the culture of democracy, is almost completely disconnected from the work that you all do on a day-to-day basis. And when we go and talk to the civic hubs that we're working with, this kind of shows up as well. And so some of the things we've learned is civic hubs are always there consistently showing up in their community. That's the reason why libraries and community foundations get such high scores. Communities know that when something goes wrong, they can call them, and they're always going to be there for decades to come. Civic hubs are really powerful at turning information into opportunities. They know when they see something that's negatively happening in their community, they know how to connect the dots to say, here's the opportunities for you to go take action. And they nurture this civic ecosystem. They know it's the puzzle of fitting all the pieces together of how people engage, how they get information, where they take action, that actually make a community great. And civic hubs are really poised and effective at being able to weave that together. The thing that strikes me, though, is I feel like I could take those 3 points, consistently showing up in a community, turning information opportunities, nurturing civic ecosystems, and I could take the word civic hub out of that description and replace local journalism, and it would all be true. That's the way I feel about it, but it's not necessarily the way that people always experience it. Let's see if I can do a little technical skill here at the same time. That people always experience it. And so, as I think about what that means, the lessons that we've learned, I feel like what the opportunity that we have in our work in civic hubs, the work in civic engagement, is to actually build the bridge back to local journalism. Because when we've gone out in local communities and tried to engage in local journalism, we have 2 very distinct experiences, and I think it speaks to this like radical differentiation that we might see and why those trust scores might be low. Even when have had opportunities to make grants, we've had a few very clear responses come back in some but not all communities. One is that we've heard that it isn't the role of journalism to increase civic engagement and steward participation or get involved in that local civic ecosystem because it jeopardizes the journalistic independence and objectivity. I think that's an understandable position and one I imagine has probably a long history of debate in the field of journalism. Not one I'm an expert on, but I could imagine. In other communities, we've seen reporting that focuses more on national issues in framing than those that are locally rooted. So just last week, I was with a local community, and someone was highlighting the lack of local journalism in their community by showcasing that the past 10 op-eds to show up in their local newspaper, 8 of them were about national issues. And they felt that should be switched. If not, all 10 should be about local issues. And others feel there just isn't the capacity for local media to show up consistently, to be that weaver, and leaving the community in doubt that they're going to be there when they need them most. So I think there's a lot of reasons and conditions, sometimes ones that are about what is the role of journalism, and sometimes it's about do we even have the capacity to show up in these types of ways and have that sustainable presence. But at the same time, we've experienced some remarkable examples of where it's working. So for example, in the Mississippi Delta, we actually funded the Gulf State Newsroom who did reporting on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. They did it through listening sessions of allowing community members to come together and tell their stories, and then shape that into a shared community story. And then they made space inside of that for local community organizations to come and talk about how they could get involved in changing the next story. The next hurricane's gonna come. We're gonna have this experience again. How do we work as a community to be prepared for that? They created this incredible handoff into the community and into civic engagement. Right now, we're running or about to make a whole series of grants, dozens of them through the civic hubs that we've invested in into 2 groups, young people and then libraries in their local communities. As we've looked across the themes of applications that have come into us, one of the overwhelming top themes is communities creating local news and media programs. The demand is incredibly high, and they want to have the opportunity to see their voice put out there and be engaged, and so they're going and creating lots of cool ways to do that, sometimes in partnership with local journalism and news. And in Dubuque, Iowa, the Community Foundation has held community screenings of News Without a Newsroom, bringing local residents into opportunities to take action to champion local journalism and working together to build its capacity. So what this tells me is that there's an incredible opportunity, but there's also an incredible disconnect. And that when we put together the civic aspirations and infrastructure of a community with local journalism, that's when we have the opportunity to meet our full potential. And it's when we have the opportunity to go all the way back to the beginning of my remarks that people start to feel seen for who they truly are. Because who is the greatest, best storyteller for a community? It's local journalism. Hands down, no one else can play that role. And so where do we go from here? Well, I think for communities that have the fortune of having civic hubs, it's a built-in partner. They're ready to go to be a conduit of helping build the connections as well as the capacity of local journalism. They can align on priorities and opportunities and bring residents together to take action. They can connect the dots among civic leaders. They can build that capacity that I think local journalism absolutely needs. For communities without a civic hub, I'd love to see journalism's role in helping create one. Sometimes it's telling us as philanthropists what's actually happening out there. And for us, we do all of our work through nominations because we know that the people in communities know what's happening best. So it's feeding us who are the organizations that are building the civic landscape. I think it's also the opportunity to be that weaver of connecting the organizations in communities who sometimes don't quite see what's happening with each other, or at times, often by philanthropy, can actually be pitted against each other in creating unnecessary competition. And I think the last one is inviting residents to dream and align on a priority and vision. I think once again, who is better situated to help a community understand its own aspirations than local journalists? And where there may be a question of journalism's role, I wonder if we actually have any other option than to get involved as an active civic leader in actively building the success of these communities. For me and the work that we do in the national philanthropists I represent, we believe that America's future is going to be decided in local communities, not at the national level. And we feel that when people feel unseen and feel left behind by national institutions that we're supposed to serve them, they're going to stop trusting. And we can't fix that from far away. But what we can do is fix it in our local communities through the day-to-day experiences people have. And the Trust for Civic Life's investment in civic hubs is one step, but I personally don't think we can succeed without the help of all of you. I don't think it's possible. And to do that, our fields have to come into concert and come into work more closely together. As I was preparing for today, I talked with Richard Young, who's over in Lexington, Kentucky, who some of you may know, and leads Civic Lex, a group that actually has blended exactly what I'm talking about today, local journalism and civic engagement. And he started telling me all the things that are happening in local journalism at a national level. And I didn't know about 99% of them. I didn't even know what some of the terms meant. I was like, you actually have to explain that for me, or I gotta write them down and Google them later. That is a huge problem. And that's a problem that I have to take responsibility for solving as well. I have to be able to step into this world more often, and it's why I feel I'm incredibly encouraged and thankful to be invited here today. But I also know it has to come from both sides, and we have to find the ways to start to weave our worlds together. Because at the end of the day, if we don't do that, communities are going to feel unseen and unheard. And if we do it, I think we rewrite the next story of the American experience. So thank you for having me here today. I'll bring Heidi up, and I think we're going to do a little Q&A. So thanks, everybody. Cool.
Two microphones.
No. Oh, over here. Gotcha.
I've been told I speak very quietly, so I need a microphone. Aaron's back there telling me to speak up. So, okay, well, thank you, Charlie. I was kind of surprised by your comment about the trusted civic institution of journalism being ranked lower. I really thought you were building too loud. But what are the
Sorry,
three?
everybody.
And then you blew over, no, it's these three, and I was like, okay, well, good to know.
Yeah.
And you've talked about journalism being part of a broader civic ecosystem. If you're a publisher of a small news outlet in Ashland or Brownsville or Tillamook, what's one thing you would encourage them to do differently when they get home?
Well, I think one is, I obviously have a lot to learn about exactly what you do when you're already home. And so I know part of it is I need to learn. I think one opportunity is to start to reach out to folks like myself, which also can be local philanthropy that's here in the state, to start to educate us. What's happening? What's going on? What are the opportunities you see in your community? And I think the second one is if there is a group that may be a civic hub, and I can share more about what that might mean to give you more context, or just who's an active civic organization in your community, and start the conversation of how do we work more closely together. At the end of the day, when I see it working really well, the relationships between a publisher and its local community and the civic leaders is really high and really strong.
Great, good to know. And you mentioned that we may need to operate, local journalism may need to operate with new partners. Who are those partners, and what kind of relationships do you see that would make the biggest difference in those communities?
Yeah, so whether you're local journalists or whether you're a civic organization that might be that business association or that library program, the reality is everybody's operating with not enough resources. Just everybody. And I was at a philanthropy convening actually here in Bend a few months ago, and one of the questions from some of the audience was, well, how do we get more resources and how do we get more philanthropy? And I think the answer that I heard from philanthropies was, well, we'll create more programs. We'll create more opportunities for you to engage. And personally, I think it's the wrong answer, because there are finite philanthropic dollars. We're not going to magically create a ton more. And so the real answer is, how do you work in concert to be able to be more efficient, effective, build new opportunities, and then also show what's happening and show an example of what other communities need to do. And so when I think about what that partnership looks like, part of it is working with those civic organizations, getting more dollars into the community, and then the other partnership is, who are the community foundations? Who are the local philanthropists? Who are the local organizations that can actually drive that dollars for sustainability? Because while philanthropy is my world, I will tell you that we are often all too disconnected from what's happening in the community, and we're often looking for that steward who can come and tell us what is possible. I think one of those best stewards are probably local journalists.
I appreciate that, because what I like about your organization, your focus is you listen. My experience with philanthropy is you fill out a grant that meets certain requirements, and you've got to try to fit what you're trying to do inside of those requirements of that grant, or forget about going any further with it. What I've observed with you when you were at the Regards to Rural conference and just getting to know you over the last couple of years is you don't come with the answers. You come with the funding, and you make smart decisions about how you're going to focus that funding, but I so appreciate that. It's a refreshing difference.
Well, at the end of the day, if we knew what worked, we wouldn't be having this event, and I wouldn't be having all the other events I go to. But for some reason, I think all too often in philanthropy, we feel we need to come with a orientation that says, here's the answer. If you would just do these 5 things, it would all work out. But I think that's a fool's errand, and most communities know that. It's that point I made that we have to contort ourselves all too often to get the resources that we need. Instead, I feel like you're all our learning partners. And what we're trying to figure out is, what does it look like to rebuild an American experience where people have that sense of trust, agency, and opportunity to live in a place, not just feel prideful about it, but feel it's going to deliver the opportunities for generations to come to stay there and be successful. Like, that's what we have to figure out. And so we don't know what the answer is, and probably the best way to do that is to come and work with you all and your counterparts in your local communities to have you show us what's working, what's not working, and then how do we become, in many ways, a switchboard across the country to say, well, here's what's worked over in Dubuque, Iowa. Would it work here too? Or here's what's working right here in Oregon. Could that work somewhere else in the country?
That's great, because, and speaking of which, there's publishers here today. By far the majority of the audience are publishers, but there's also philanthropy, public policy. What do you want them to take away from this?
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do. I think we have a lot of work to do in understanding what's happening in local communities, and we have a lot of listening to do to see where our dollars and where our efforts can be most effective. At the end of the day, if we thought about ourselves as a service, all of you and your communities are our customers. And how do we make sure that we're actually delivering value so that you can improve the quality of life in your communities successfully? I also think the second part of that, and I'll just give a quick anecdote. I mentioned I was in the Adirondacks a couple weeks ago. I was talking with a public librarian at Long Lake, so a small community right in the center of the Adirondacks and the park that's there. He had worked for something like 20 years in New York City, specifically Bed-Stuy, that borough. And what he said is this is the first time in his career he's had the opportunity to experiment and innovate. Because often when you're in an urban, largely built environment, there's just a bureaucracy that comes with that and an immovability of the systems and programs that are there. And he's like, now that I'm in a rural area, it's like, I'm trying new things all the time. He's like, but my question is, how do I get recognized for that? And then how do I show the rest of the country what's happening? Because we are the laboratory of innovation. I think for philanthropy, we have to really look at rural communities in that exact same way. Because rural communities have the flexibility and opportunity to do so many things we can't do anywhere else in the country. We have to reward that.
Amen to that, because it's encouraging. It's disappointing to see the percentage of rural that represents the population, and then the percentage of philanthropy that actually gets to rural. It's a challenge, and I think everybody in this room feels it. You made a comment that local journalism isn't covering community life. It's part of community life. Can you unpack that? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, so in some of the examples I gave, I think the Gulf State Newsroom reporting on the 25th anniversary of Katrina was a really good example. When we started that conversation with them, they themselves were a little hesitant to say, like, we're not really sure how far we should extend our role into engaging the community. But when I said, well, tell me about what you hope to achieve. They're like, what we hope to achieve is the story we will tell, and the story our communities will tell is not the story we will tell next time. I'm like, okay, well, what's it take to do that? And they're like, well, the first thing is we have to know what was the story. What is the actual story? What is our shared experience? The second thing we have to know is what would we have done differently? And they felt that community members were best positioned to tell that, not necessarily someone coming from a state agency or a federal agency, but it was the communities themselves who had the best understanding. The third thing they said is, and then we actually need civic leadership who's going to carry that story forward. So it's great. How are you going to engage that civic leadership? And immediately they were like, here's how we're going to integrate that into all of our activities. We're going to create these listening sessions. We're going to create these events in local communities. We're going to partner with local organizations. They partnered with the Community Foundation. And it was a real success. It was really cool, I think, to see the local community members feel like they were the ones who were actually at the front of the solution, not the ones at the end waiting to see what would happen and how the story would unfold.
So are there any questions from the audience? Because I think we're going to wrap up here in just a minute. Well, thank you, Charlie.
Ken Engelman, Mackenzie River Reflections. In our area, we're heavily fire impacted, and we're getting federal dollars and foundation dollars. Since the fire